the Eternal City's Twilight, Meta, Pause, Sex, 2.0. In the ruins of the Roman Forum, bronze coins lie fused into marble, melted in a fire set 17 centuries ago, their green stains still visible in the stone. This is the story of how that fire came to burn. 2.0. Part 1. The Apogee, Rome at its zenith. Metapause, Sex, 2.0. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the city of Rome stood as the apotheosis of human ambition, a metropolis of marble and gardens, home to perhaps 1 million souls crammed into 44,000 apartment blocks and nearly 2,000 patrician mansions. The opulence was staggering. 11 aqueducts bore water across vertiginous arches, the longest, the Aqua Marcia, stretching 91 kilometers, feeding more than 1,000 fountains and filling baths so capacious that entire neighborhoods bathed together in heated pools. The Colosseum rose 189 meters long and 48 meters tall, its travertine flanks glittering in the sun. A retractable canvas awning, the velarium, operated by 1,000 sailors from the naval base at Misenum, shaded 50,000 spectators from the noonday heat. Sex, 0.5. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian, crowned the cityscape with an unreinforced concrete dome 43 meters across, its builders layering heavy basalt and travertine at the base, then progressively lighter volcanic pumice toward the apex, a feat of engineering so audacious that its span remains unsurpassed to this day. The 9-meter oculus stood open to the sky so that rain fell through and lambent light moved across the coffered ceiling like a sundial measuring the hours of empire. Sex, 0.5. In Trajan's Forum, designed by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus, a column 38 meters tall bore a spiraling frieze of 2,662 carved figures commemorating the Dacian Wars, while the twin reading rooms of the Ulpian Library, one Greek, one Latin, faced each other across a colonnaded courtyard lined with Egyptian granite and Numidian marble. Frontinus, the water commissioner, gazed upon Rome's aqueducts and declared with justifiable pride, "Compare, if you will, the idol pyramids or the useless, though famous, works of the Greeks." The empire's reach was vast. From Britannia to Syria, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the marshes of the Danube Delta, Rome's dominion encompassed 5 million square kilometers of territory, perhaps 70 million subjects, governed by a single legal code, and connected by 80,000 kilometers of paved roads along which imperial couriers galloped day and night. Its legions enforced a Pax Romana that rendered the Mediterranean a common market of trade and exchange. Silk from Cathay, spices from Arabia, fruit from the Nile. The abundance would have seemed supernatural to earlier, meager generations. Ships rode the Indian Ocean monsoons to bring pepper and cinnamon and pearls to Roman tables, a commerce so vast that Pliny the Elder grumbled that 100 million sestertii drained eastward each year, the price of Roman appetite for luxuries from lands the legions would never reach. The air in the capital was redolent with saffron and roasting meat. The Greek rhetorician Aelius Aristides marveled that so many merchant ships arrived every hour that Rome was like a kind of common emporium of the world. Rome did not merely flourish, it reveled in an abundance that beggared the imagination. Yet even at this zenith, the prescient observer might have detected signs of strain. The very plenitude that dazzled the senses bred a dangerous satiety among the ruling class, a listlessness born of excess that the Romans called torpor. Beyond the walls, the latifundia, vast slave-worked estates, had swallowed the independent farms that once furnished Rome's citizen soldiers, and Pliny the Elder had already warned that the great estates were the ruin of Italy. The poet Juvenal, acidulous and unsparing, reduced the people's remaining political aspirations to 2 words: panem et circenses, bread and circuses, and nothing more. The exorbitant cost of maintaining such splendor, the standing armies that consumed perhaps 70% of imperial revenue, the free grain distributed to some 200,000 citizens, the 135 days of public games each year, was a burden that could not be borne in perpetuity. But who, standing amid such magnificence, could imagine that it was anything but immutable? Edward Gibbon, writing 16 centuries later, would pronounce this the happiest and most prosperous period in the history of the human race. The truth that no civilization endures forever was invisible to those who walked these streets. The eternal city seemed precisely that, a thing beyond the reach of transient fortune, destined to endure until the stars themselves grew dim. Part 2. The Philosopher-Emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Menopause, Sex, 2.0. Marcus Aurelius assumed the purple on the 7th of March 161 AD, and those who knew him recognized a ruler sui generis, a potentate who would have preferred the quiet of a library to the clamor of the Senate. Born Marcus Annius Verus, adopted at 16 by Antoninus Pius, at the express direction of the dying Hadrian, who made the adoption a condition of Pius's own succession, he had been marked from boyhood by an ascetic temperament that bewildered his aristocratic relations. At 12 he donned the rough Greek cloak of a philosopher, slept on the ground, and pursued his studies with such ardor that the Historia Augusta records the only fault to be found with his early life was the damage his labors inflicted on his health. He was sagacious where others were merely shrewd, magnanimous where they were grasping, and from his first act as emperor he revealed his character, immediately elevating Lucius Verus as co-Augustus, the first time in Roman history that two emperors shared equal constitutional standing. His Meditations, written not in Latin but in the Koine Greek of philosophy, scrawled in campaign tents by guttering lamplight on the banks of the Danube, at a place he noted as among the Quadi, at the Gran, revealed a mind of extraordinary acuity and discernment, pellucid in its reasoning, lucid in its self-examination, and possessed of a rectitude that put lesser men to shame. He practiced temperance in an age of excess, moderation when extravagance was expected, and restraint when power invited its opposite. His prose was pithy where others was verbose, its eloquence arising not from grandiloquence, but from the unadorned clarity of hard-won conviction. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be, he admonished himself. Be one. All things fade, he wrote elsewhere, and quickly turn to fable and then to oblivion. He reminded himself that even the most powerful are ephemeral, that the court of Augustus, with all its pomp and ceremony, had become dust and mockery. His integrity was not the performed virtue of a politician, but the earned conviction of a man who had subjected every impulse to dispassionate scrutiny. He was stoic not merely in philosophical affiliation, but in lived practice, composed under provocations that would have shattered a less disciplined soul. His counselors found him even-tempered in deliberation and unruffled by the sycophantic flattery that swirled around the imperial court. Where other emperors demanded fawning obeisance, Marcus valued candor above all. He sought the forthright counsel of men like Fronto and Rusticus, advisors whose veracious assessments he trusted precisely because they refused to palter or equivocate. From Rusticus he learned to reject rhetorical display and the empty ornament of persuasion, and it was Rusticus who placed in his hands the Discourses of Epictetus, the single most formative philosophical text of his life, the work that taught him to distinguish between what is in our power and what is not. From Fronto, whose 200 surviving letters testify to their intimacy, he absorbed a love of the precise word, the mot juste, that illuminates rather than dazzles. 0.8. Yet this paragon of uprightness was fated to preside over an empire already beset by mounting crises. The Antonine plague, carried westward by legions returning from Parthia, swept through the provinces with maleficent indifference. The physician Galen, who treated patients in Rome itself, described its fever, the eruption of red and black papules on the 9th day, the scabby husks they left behind, leaving destitution and bewilderment in its wake. It claimed even the imperial family. Lucius Verus, Marcus's co-emperor, died of the plague in January 169, leaving Marcus to bear the weight of empire alone. Along the Danube frontier, Germanic tribes pressed southward with mounting ferocity. The Marcomanni and Quadi, peoples whose enmity Rome had long managed through a combination of diplomacy and force, now sensed vulnerability and tested the boundaries of imperial power. In the depths of this crisis, when his legions were surrounded and parched with thirst, a sudden downpour saved the 12th Legion Fulminata from annihilation. a miracle attributed by pagans to Jupiter and by Christians to prayer, immortalized in spiraling relief on the column of Marcus Aurelius that still stands in Piazza Colonna. Marcus met these crises with the steadfast resolve and unwavering self-discipline that defined his character. He sold the imperial furniture at auction in the Forum of Trajan to fund the legions rather than raise taxes on a populace already strained by pestilence. Gold and crystal goblets, marine cups, royal flagons, statues, paintings by great masters, even his wife Faustina's silken gold-embroidered robes and the jewels found in Hadrian's private cabinet. The sale lasted 2 months, and when it was done, he offered to buy back any item its purchaser wished to return, but imposed no penalty on those who chose to keep what they had bought. He was, in the estimation of later historians, the last of the 5 good emperors, an exemplary and stalwart defender of civic virtue in an era that was rapidly forgetting what virtue meant. His prudence was not the timorous caution of a man afraid to act, but the judicious deliberation of one who understood that every imperial decision reverberated across a continent. When he died at Vindobona in 180 AD, tradition records that when asked for the watchword on his final night, he replied, "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." The empire lost something more precious than a competent administrator. It lost its conscience, and with it, the camaraderie and fellowship that bound emperor to legionary, patron to client. His gilded bronze equestrian statue, over 4 meters tall, cast by the lost wax method, now preserved in the Capitoline museums with a replica standing in the piazza, survived the centuries only because medieval Christians mistook it for Constantine, a beautiful irony that the Philosopher-Emperor, who wrote that fame is meaningless, owed his likeness to a case of mistaken identity. Marcus was the last sovereign who believed that power was a trust held on behalf of the governed, not a license for self-enrichment. His death was not merely an event, but a threshold, the liminal moment between what Rome had been and what it would become. Part 3. The Dissolute Heir, Commodus. Sex 2.0. The metamorphosis was swift and grotesque. Commodus, Marcus's sole surviving son, the first Roman emperor ever born during his father's reign, the first truly born in the purple, a distinction that would not recur until Constantine's sons a century and a half later, ascended at 18, carrying none of his father's sapience and all of the appetites that Stoic philosophy had taught Marcus to suppress. Ancient sources describe him as handsome, with curly blonde hair, but the comeliness was superficial. Beneath it lay a character untouched by the disciplines that had forged his father. His twin brother had died at 4. His younger brother Marcus Annius Verus perished after a failed operation at 7. Commodus alone survived of Marcus's sons, the sole male heir to a dynasty that had thrived on adoption rather than blood. Where the father had been temperate, the son was profligate, squandering the treasury on gladiatorial spectacles of breathtaking turpitude. Where Marcus had been conscientious, Commodus was dissolute, surrendering governance to a succession of favorites whose venality was exceeded only by their incompetence. He was, in the damning judgment of the senator Cassius Dio, who was there, who watched, who chewed laurel leaves from his garland, and persuaded those sitting near him to do the same, so that the steady movement of their jaws might conceal the laughter that would have meant their deaths. The man who dragged history from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust, debauched by unlimited power, before he had the maturity to comprehend its responsibilities. His reign was a masterclass in fatuity. Convinced of his own divinity, he renamed the months of the calendar after his own titles: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculeus, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius. An act of such asinine vanity that even his most servile courtiers struggled to maintain their obsequious composure. He declared himself the new Romulus and ritually refounded Rome as Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana, the Senate, the Commodian Fortunate Senate, the legions, the Commodianae, the grain fleet from Africa, the Commodian Herculean fleet. He fought in the arena as a gladiator, 735 contests, always as a left-handed secutor, slaughtering ostriches with crescent-headed arrows and dispatching crippled opponents with a showmanship that was both puerile and fiendish, demanding 1 million sesterzi from the gladiatorial fund for each appearance. He ordered wounded soldiers and amputees dragged into the arena. Citizens who had lost their feet through injury or illness were lashed together so Commodus could club them to death, pretending they were giants or serpent-footed monsters. The work of a churlish tyrant who mistook bellicose display for martial valor, while senators sat in mortified silence, their faces masks of compelled admiration. He decapitated an ostrich and approached the senatorial seats, carrying the severed head in his left hand, his bloody sword raised in his right, grinning, wagging his head, the implied threat unmistakable. The spectacle was not merely odious. It was a calculated debasement of the imperial office, a flagitious mockery of the dignity that men like Marcus Aurelius had labored to uphold. Those who witnessed it felt a crapulence of the soul, the nausea that comes from overexposure to a surfeit of the grotesque. Sex 1.0. A marble bust from this period, discovered in 1874 in the underground chambers of the Horti Lamiani, survives in the Capitoline museums. Commodus dressed as Hercules, draped in the skin of the Nemean lion, holding the club of Hercules in his right hand and the golden apples of the Hesperides in his left, the whole resting on an allegorical base of kneeling Amazons and a celestial globe. The archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler suggested the sculptor was deliberately subversive. The contrast between the trappings of the genuine hero and the effeminate, self-obsessed emperor, too grotesque to be taken only as an idolizing portrait. It was the philosopher's son reimagined as a demigod of the arena, and the marble itself seemed to smirk at the pretension. Sex 8.
The rot spread outward from the palace like a contagion. When the Antonine plague returned in 189 AD with redoubled fury, 2,000 died daily in the capital. Dio Cassius counted them. Yet Commodus withdrew to the estate at Laurentum, leaving Rome to bury its dead without so much as an imperial edict of consolation. Provincial governors, recognizing that the center could no longer hold them accountable, grew despotic in their own domains. Military discipline eroded as commanders realized that loyalty to such a vacuous emperor brought no reward, while disloyalty carried diminishing risk. The cursory attention Commodus paid to frontier defense allowed incursions that a generation earlier would have been unthinkable. Barbarian depredations, once minor irritants managed by a vigilant bureaucracy, became endemic. A chronic hemorrhage of blood and treasure along borders that stretched from the Rhine to the Euphrates. The court itself became a pit of skullduggery and legerdemain, a place where advancement depended not on merit, but on one's willingness to participate in the emperor's delusions. His ministers were elevated for their talent at flattery rather than governance. His favorites rose and fell in a diabolical cycle of favor, betrayal, and blood. Seoterus, the Bithynian freedman from Nicomedia, who had ridden beside the emperor in his ceremonial chariot, was murdered by the very man who would replace him. Perennis, the Praetorian prefect who effectively ruled the empire while Commodus devoted himself to pleasure, was executed along with his wife and sons when British soldiers marched to Rome to denounce him. Cleander, the Phrygian freedman who sold the principal offices of the state to the highest bidder, met his end when a grain riot at the Games of Ceres left his severed head bouncing through the streets and his young sons slaughtered beside him. The end came on the 31st of December, 192 AD, New Year's Eve. A servant had discovered a list of those Commodus intended to execute. Among the names were his own concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and his Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Latus. With their deaths imminent, the three moved to act first. Marcia poisoned his food. When the emperor vomited and the dose proved insufficient, the conspirators sent in Narcissus, Commodus's wrestling partner and personal trainer, the very man who had prepared him for his gladiatorial appearances, who strangled the emperor in his bath, or, as Herodian has it, in his bed as he lay in a drunken, poison-weakened stupor. Rome breathed a collective sigh that mingled relief with dread. His name was struck from every monument, his statues toppled, the original name of the city restored.
the Senate declared him a public enemy and enacted a de facto damnatio memoriae, their ultimate posthumous verdict. Pertinax was proclaimed emperor on the 1st of January 193, but the licentious reprobate's removal solved nothing, for no mechanism existed for an orderly succession. The assassination opened the chaotic year of the 5 emperors, and the chaos that followed would not be contained for a century.
Part 4. The Crisis of the 3rd Century. 2.0. What followed was a maelstrom of vicissitudes so relentless that later historians would call it simply the crisis, a half-century of flux and fracture that nearly annihilated the Roman state. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire endured some 26 claimants to the purple, barracks emperors elevated by mutinous legions without political experience, distinguished ancestors, or hereditary claim. The vast majority died by murder. Maximinus Thrax, a semi-literate Thracian peasant who had never set foot in Rome, was the first to rule by military acclamation alone. His own soldiers hacked off his head at the siege of Aquileia and sent it to the capital on a pike. Decius perished in the marshes of Abritus, slaughtered alongside his son by Goths. The first Roman emperor killed in battle against a foreign enemy, his body never recovered from the swamp. The oscillation between rulers was dizzying, each permutation of power bloodier and more capricious than the last. Generals proclaimed themselves emperor at breakfast and were murdered by their own bodyguards before supper. The throne became a thing not coveted but feared, a volatile seat that consumed its occupants with mechanical indifference. The empire's borders buckled under simultaneous assault. Goths ravaged the Balkans and sacked the ancient city of Athens. Along the Rhine, Alemanni and Franks poured through weakened defenses in tumultuous waves, pillaging cities that had known peace for generations. But the gravest menace lay east, where the Sassanid dynasty, a resurgent Zoroastrian empire that claimed the mantle of the ancient Achaemenid kings, bore the title Shah-an-Shah, King of Kings, and framed its wars against Rome as a cosmic struggle between the heirs of Cyrus and the heirs of Alexander, overran Mesopotamia, and captured the Emperor Valerian himself at Edessa in 260 AD. It was an ignominious humiliation without precedent, the only Roman emperor ever taken alive by a foreign enemy. Shapur I commemorated his triumph in a trilingual inscription carved at the Kaaba-ye-Zar-Tasht, and in a monumental rock relief hewn into the cliff at Naqsh-e-Rostam, directly beneath the tombs of the Achaemenid kings, a deliberate act of dynastic appropriation. The relief, 11 meters wide and 5 meters high, showed Philip the Arab kneeling in supplication, Valerian grasped by the wrist and dragged into captivity, the great king of Persia on horseback towering above them both in serene dominance. The hostile Christian writer Lactantius would later claim that Shapur used the captive emperor as a human mounting block, setting his foot upon Valerian's shoulders whenever he climbed onto his horse, and that when Valerian finally died, his skin was flayed, dyed vermilion, and hung in a Persian temple as a perpetual admonition to Roman ambassadors. Modern scholars have challenged this lurid account. Sassanid sources suggest the captives were resettled, and their engineering expertise put to use building dams and bridges for the Persian crown. Roman ingenuity, extracted by force, serving the empire that had humiliated Rome in battle. Whether tortured or merely subjugated, the spectacle of a Roman emperor in Persian hands sent shockwaves through the civilized world. The once impenetrable frontier had become precarious, tottering under pressures that multiplied faster than depleted legions could address them. Within, the damage was equally devastating. Plague returned, the plague of Cyprian, named for the bishop of Carthage who chronicled its horrors in his treatise De Mortalitate. Cyprian's description was clinical in its pastoral clarity. The bowels relaxed into a constant flux, he wrote, a fire originated in the marrow, the intestines were shaken with continual vomiting, the eyes filled with injected blood, the feet and limbs were taken off by the contagion of diseased putrefaction. And all of this, the bishop added with terrible serenity, was profitable as a proof of faith. At the plague's zenith, 5,000 died daily in Rome alone. It killed 2 emperors and gutted the legions so thoroughly that the army was forced to recruit from the very Germanic peoples beyond the frontier it was meant to hold. Agriculture collapsed as farmers fled fields that barbarian depredations had rendered untenable, leaving deplorable wastelands where once productive estates had stood. The agri deserti, deserted fields, a term that would haunt Roman legal texts for centuries. The currency suffered repeated debasement, each successive emperor adulterating the coinage. The denarius, 95% pure silver under Augustus, had been debased to barely 50% by the reign of Septimius Severus. The Antoninianus that replaced it in 215 was a fraud from inception, officially valued at 2 denarii, but containing silver worth barely 1.5. And by 270, its silver content had plummeted to a mere 2.5%, until the coins were little more than copper slugs with a microscopic silver wash that rubbed off in circulation. Soldiers bit their coins to test them. If the silver flaked away to reveal base metal beneath, the payment was worthless. Inflation spiraled beyond control, creating a dearth of basic goods that drove the urban poor to the brink of starvation. Barter replaced monetary exchange across vast swaths of the countryside, and the government itself began collecting taxes in kind rather than in coin it knew to be worthless. The schism was not merely political, but civilizational. Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania broke away as the Gallic Empire under Postumus, who established his own senate, his own consuls, his own mints, and whose coins, having access to Spanish silver mines, were of superior quality to Rome's own debased coinage. Postumus was no mere warlord, but an able administrator. His reward was to be murdered by his own troops for forbidding them to sack a defeated city, an ironic echo of the dysfunction consuming the Central Empire, the best ruler killed for his virtues rather than his vices. In the east, the provinces coalesced around the desert city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia, multilingual, ferociously ambitious, claiming descent from Cleopatra herself, whose armies conquered Egypt, Arabia, and Anatolia until she controlled a third of the Roman world. The estrangement of province from province, the dissolution of every bond of solidarity and comity that had once held the Roman world together, was now complete. What had been a singular, if unwieldy, political entity was now senescent, fragmented, exhausted, its very survival indeterminate. Only Aurelian, the soldier emperor, whom his contemporaries called Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, managed to reunify the fragments, defeating Zenobia at the battles of Imai and Emesa, parading her through Rome in golden chains, crushing the Gallic secession at Chalons, and then circling the capital itself with 19 kilometers of fortified walls, 381 towers of brick-faced concrete, built not by soldiers, for none could be spared, but by the citizens themselves. That Rome should need walls after 6 centuries without them was itself an admission that the Pax Romana was finished. And even Aurelian, the empire's best hope, could not escape the age's corrosive logic. He was assassinated in 275 by officers who had been duped by his own secretary's forged documents. The restorer of the world, murdered over a functionary's lie. From this nadir, recovery would require not a philosopher, but a soldier, not wisdom, but iron. Part 5. Diocletian's Iron Hand. 2.0. Diocletian rose from origins so humble that later hagiographers would struggle to embellish them. Born Diocles around 244 AD in the Roman province of Dalmatia, the son of a scribe, or perhaps a freedman of a senator named Antoninus, he was industrious, resolute, canny, and utterly without illusion about the nature of power. He rose through the ranks under the soldier emperors Aurelian and Probus until, by 282, he commanded the Protectores Domestici, the elite cavalry bodyguard of the imperial household. His accession was forged in blood. On November 20th, 284 AD, after the emperor Numerian was found dead in his litter, murdered, it was said, by the Praetorian prefect Aper, the army of the East assembled on a hill outside Nicomedia and saluted Diocles as the new Augustus. He accepted the purple, and in his first act as emperor,
personally drove his sword through Aper before the assembled troops, then Latinized his name to the more imposing Gaius Valerius Diocletianus. It was a statement of intent. This was not a man who would delegate violence. His ascendancy marked a watershed moment, not a return to the golden age of the Antonines, but the birth of something altogether different, a frankly autocratic state that dispensed with the polite fictions of the old republic. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and his imperious manner left no doubt that he meant it. His reforms were sedulous in their thoroughness and peremptory in their execution. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each governed by a senior Augustus supported by a junior Caesar, the Tetrarchy, formally established in 293. Diocletian himself presiding over the east from Nicomedia with Galerius as his Caesar, his old comrade Maximian ruling the west from Milan with Constantius Chlorus at Trier. The system was designed to prevent the murderous competition for sole power that had characterized the preceding decades. Succession, in theory, would proceed without bloodshed, as each Caesar stepped up to replace his Augustus and appointed a new deputy in turn. He subdivided the old provinces from roughly 50 into 100, each too small for any governor to accumulate a dangerous concentration of power, then grouped them into 12 dioceses under vicars, the origin of the ecclesiastical term, and doubled the civil service to some 30,000 functionaries. Tax collection was rationalized. The army was expanded from 300,000 to perhaps 500,000 men, reorganized into border troops and mobile field armies. He fixed prices by imperial edict, nearly 1,400 goods and services enumerated with painstaking specificity, from wheat at 100 denarii per modius to a carpenter's daily wage at 50, a doctrinaire attempt to control the inflation that had ravaged the economy. The result was a conspicuous failure. Merchants simply withdrew goods from the market or sold them illicitly, and Lactantius, an eyewitness, recorded that scarcity grew more excessive and grievous than ever. The effort was Herculean, enforcement often fitful in the provinces, but the intent was unmistakable: to reimpose order through the sheer, redoubtable force of imperial will. The Tetrarchs themselves he rendered in a sculptural group now embedded in the corner of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. 4 identical figures carved in imperial porphyry, the rare purple stone quarried from Mons porphyrites in the Egyptian desert, their faces interchangeable, their embrace a statement that the system mattered more than any individual within it. The sculpture had been looted from Constantinople by Venetian crusaders in 1204, and one figure was missing part of its foot. In 1965, a Turkish-German excavation beneath the Bodrum Mosque in Istanbul, built over a 10th-century Byzantine church, recovered a porphyry heel that fit the Venice group perfectly, the material analysis confirming they were carved from the same stone. The missing foot, reunited after 7.5 centuries. Diocletian's was a regime that brooked no dissent. He replaced the old principate model of imperial behavior, in which Augustus had styled himself merely princeps, first citizen, and affected republican simplicity, with an openly autocratic system that scholars call the dominate. He demanded not merely obedience but prostration, the adoratio, a ritual borrowed from the Persian court of the Sassanid king of kings, transforming the emperor from first among equals to living deity. Those permitted the supreme favor kissed the hem of his purple silk robe, the adoratio purpurae, while lesser mortals fell face first to the marble floor. On formal occasions he wore a diadem of jewels rather than the traditional laurel wreath, shoes adorned with precious stones, robes of purple silk, and he insisted on the title Dominus et Deus, a deliberate break with centuries of calculated imperial modesty. Those who refused to offer incense to the imperial image were branded heretics against the state. The Christians, whose growing numbers and stubborn monotheism represented a challenge to the new orthodoxy, bore the heaviest burden of his malice. The immediate trigger was an oracle. In 302, the oracle of Apollo at Didyma declared that it could not give prophecies because of the righteous on the earth, interpreted as referring to Christians. The great persecution that followed, beginning in 303 AD, was systematic in its cruelty and prosecuted through 4 successive edicts of escalating severity. On the morning of February 23rd, the feast of the Terminalia, god of boundaries, a date chosen with deliberate symbolism, the prefect, together with tribunes and treasury officers, arrived at the great church of Nicomedia, which stood within sight of Diocletian's own palace. The gates were forced open, the scriptures seized and committed to the flames, and the Praetorian Guard leveled that very lofty edifice with the ground in a matter of hours. Lactantius was there. He saw it. Subsequent edicts ordered the imprisonment of all clergy, then offered amnesty to those who agreed to sacrifice to the gods, and finally extended the requirement of public sacrifice to every Roman citizen, a machinery of contumely and coercion that ground through the eastern provinces with merciless efficiency. Those who questioned the emperor's edicts were denounced. Those who defied them were destroyed. The persecution fell hardest on those least able to resist, provincial congregations whose only crime was a refusal to equivocate about the nature of the divine. Some Christians proved recreant under pressure, surrendering sacred texts to imperial agents. The traditores, those who hand over, a Latin word that would give English its word traitor. Their co-religionists, who refused, condemned them as apostates, and the bitter divide between traditores and confessors would fracture the North African church for generations, producing the Donatist schism. Others held firm with a resolve that earned even the grudging respect of their persecutors, dauntless and tenacious men and women whose stout-hearted conviction no amount of imperial opprobrium could shake. The blood of the martyrs, Tertullian declared, is the seed of the church. In the western provinces, the persecution was applied unevenly. Constantius Chlorus enforced only the first edict, demolishing some churches but making few arrests and apparently ordering no executions. The seditious charge leveled against Christians, that their allegiance to a heavenly kingdom constituted disloyalty to the earthly one, was a specious conflation of spiritual conviction with political subversion, but it served Diocletian's purposes well enough.
He retired voluntarily on May 1, 305 AD, the first and arguably the only Roman emperor ever to do so, returning to the same hill outside Nicomedia where he had been proclaimed emperor 21 years earlier, removing the purple before a statue of Jupiter and placing it on the shoulders of his Caesar Galerius. He then repaired to a vast palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast at Spa Latum, 214 meters by 175, modeled on a Roman military camp, its walls rising 22 meters above the Adriatic, its 4 gates named for gold, silver, iron, and bronze, its octagonal mausoleum destined to become one of the oldest Catholic cathedrals still in use, the nucleus of what is today the city of Split. There he grew cabbages. When the former co-emperors Maximian and Galerius urged him to reassume power, he demurred with sang-froid. "If you could see the cabbages raised by our own hands at Saloni," he replied, "you would never judge that a temptation." It was a droll remark from a man not known for levity, the only recorded instance of Diocletian's humor, and it masked a deeper truth. The system he had built depended on institutions, not individuals. He had remade the empire in his image, disciplined, harsh, efficient, and believed it could now function without him. He was wrong, of course, but his error was not apparent for another generation. Part 6. Constantine and the New Faith. Sex 2.0. The Tetrarchy unraveled with an alacrity that would have appalled its creator. Within 2 years of Diocletian's retirement, the system of orderly succession had collapsed into the very civil war it was designed to prevent, 6 competing claimants tearing at the purple like dogs at a carcass. From this chaos emerged Constantine, a commander of prodigious ambition and protean political instincts, acclaimed by his father's legions at York in the furthest corner of the empire, who would effect the most consequential paradigm shift in Western history. The story of his conversion has been told so often that it has acquired the quality of myth, and the telling itself is contested. The earliest account, by Lactantius, writing within 4 years of the event, describes a dream on the night before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. Constantine was instructed to mark his soldiers' shields with a heavenly sign, the Chi-Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Eusebius, writing decades later, inflates the vision into a daytime apparition witnessed by the entire army. A cross of light blazing above the sun with the words "in teuto nika," in this, conquer. Whether the experience constituted a genuine metanoia or a calculated political maneuver remains inscrutable even after 17 centuries of scrutiny. But the portentous event, whatever its nature, would reshape the world. What is beyond dispute is the battle itself. On October 28, Constantine's forces drove Maxentius's army back toward the Tiber. The pontoon bridge collapsed under the weight of the retreating soldiers. Maxentius himself was thrown into the river and drowned under the weight of his armor. His body was fished out the next day, decapitated, and his head mounted on a lance and paraded through the streets. The stone Milvian Bridge still stands today, spanning the Tiber 3 kilometers north of the city center. What is indubitable is the result. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan granted Christians legal toleration, not, as is often assumed, establishing Christianity as the state religion, but ending the persecution and returning confiscated property. Yet within a generation, the once persecuted sect had become the empire's dominant faith. The transmutation was breathtaking. A nascent religion of slaves and fishermen elevated to imperial orthodoxy, its bishops seated at the right hand of power, its theology debated in marble basilicas that would have dwarfed the humble house churches of the apostolic age. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the first ecumenical gathering of the Christian Church. Perhaps 300 bishops assembled at the emperor's summons, the vast majority from eastern provinces, the Bishop of Rome sending only 2 presbyters as legates. The proceedings were a revelation to those accustomed to the sententious simplicity of Scripture. Here were bishops engaging in grandiloquent theological disputation, their arguments elaborate in expression and often contentious in substance, their tone alternating between the sonorous and the shrill. The central question, the precise relationship between father and son, may seem abstruse to modern sensibilities, but for the participants it was the crux of everything. Was Christ homoousios, of the same substance as the Father, or, as Arius of Alexandria argued, a created being, the first and greatest of God's works, but not co-eternal, not of the same divine essence? The theological stakes were immense. If Christ was creature rather than creator, the entire architecture of salvation through the incarnation was undermined. Later theologians would seek a middle ground, homoousios, of similar substance, differing from orthodoxy by a single Greek letter, the iota, but at Nicaea the lines were starkly drawn. Arius found himself excoriated by the assembled bishops and condemned as a heretic, his teachings denounced as the mountebankery of a false prophet, his followers stigmatized as enemies of truth.
The council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of orthodox belief that would shape Christian doctrine for millennia. It also revealed something fateful about the new relationship between church and state. The emperor, not the bishops, held ultimate authority. Constantine presided over Nicaea sitting on a small golden seat, reportedly set lower than the bishops' chairs, a calculated display of deference by a man who functioned as a political arbiter, not a theologian. He sought consonance where the bishops found only contention, and he was willing to impose it by imperial fiat. His other magnificent achievement was the founding of Constantinople, the Nova Roma, on the site of ancient Byzantium, a Greek colony founded around 657 BC by settlers from Megara on a peninsula where the Golden Horn met the Bosporus. This was no mere administrative relocation, but a deliberate act of world-making, a presage of the empire's future center of gravity. The new capital rose on the waters of 2 continents in resplendent splendor, its forum crowned with a great porphyry column topped by a statue of Constantine himself, depicted as Apollo, the sun god, with a radiate crown, its hippodrome seating 100,000, its harbors teeming with the commerce of 2 continents, its colonnades and public spaces adorned with plundered statuary gathered from across the ancient world, its massive walls an augury of the sieges they would one day withstand. Constantinople would endure for more than 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen, a fact that lent the city an almost numinous quality, as though its founder had been gifted with prescience denied to ordinary mortals. Constantine died at Nicomedia in 337 AD, baptized at last on his deathbed, and baptized, in one of history's richest ironies, by Eusebius of Nicomedia, an Arian bishop, a follower of the very theology he had condemned at Nicaea 12 years earlier. He exchanged the imperial purple for the white robes of a Christian neophyte and died, having delayed the sacrament until the last possible moment, a common practice in the 4th century, when the Church taught that post-baptismal sin was far graver than pre-baptismal sin, so that a lifetime of necessary violence, executions, and political compromise might be washed away in a single act of cleansing. It was a strategy as calculated as everything else in Constantine's extraordinary career.
Part 7. The Barbarian Tide. Metapause, Sex 2.0. By the late 4th century, the peoples Rome called barbarians, a word that betrayed more about Roman insularity than about the cultures it described, were no longer content to skulk along the frontiers or prowl the forests beyond the limes. They came now in great migratory columns that trudged across the landscape with the slow inevitability of geological change. Visigoths and Ostrogoths, Vandals and Burgundians, Alans and Suevi, entire nations in motion, their wagons creaking, their cattle lowing, their children wailing in a cacophony of displacement and despair, their plaintive cries carried on the wind across miles of trampled earth. The old, the infirm, and the heartsore straggled behind. The young and the restive pressed ahead, driven by the anxiety of people who have no home to return to. The proximate catalyst was the arrival of the Huns, truculent nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppe, whose ferocity was, by all contemporary accounts, without parallel. Ammianus Marcellinus, the last great Roman historian, described them with a horror that mingled revulsion and awe. Their cheeks, he wrote, were deeply scored with iron from their very birth, so that the growth of hair was checked by the scars. They were beardless, squat, powerful, so hardy that they needed neither fire nor seasoned food, but lived on the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any animal, which they warmed by placing it between their thighs and the backs of their horses. They were glued to their mounts, he marveled, eating, drinking, sleeping, even conducting diplomacy from horseback. Their composite bows, 55 inches of layered wood, horn, and sinew stiffened with bone, an asymmetric design that allowed the mounted archer to pivot freely on either side of his galloping horse, delivered death at ranges that seemed uncanny to Roman eyes, with up to 80% more power than earlier steppe bows. They did not saunter or amble, they loped across the grasslands with the terrible efficiency of predators, and their horses did not plod, but galloped with a fury that shook the earth. Where they passed, they left desolation. The Groi-Thungi kingdom on the Black Sea steppe destroyed, its aged king Heir dead by his own hand rather than face subjugation. The Gothic peoples, caught between Hunnic aggression and Roman antipathy, found themselves in an agonizing impasse, a stalemate between annihilation and uncertain mercy. These intrepid peoples were not savages without culture. A generation earlier, Ulfilas, a Gothic bishop of Cappadocian Greek descent, had translated the Bible into the Gothic tongue, inventing an alphabet of 27 letters for the purpose, drawn from Greek, Latin, and runic characters. His translation survives in the Codex Argenteus, written in silver and gold ink on purple-dyed vellum, 187 leaves preserved at the University Library in Uppsala, a testament to the literary and spiritual sophistication of a people Rome persistently underestimated. The Goths who arrived at the Danube were Arian Christians, literate in their own tongue, governed by their own judges and kings. Their desperation was not barbarism, but the panic of a civilized people fleeing annihilation. In 376 AD, the Visigoths appeared on the northern bank of the Danube, begging admission to the empire. The throng was immense. Contemporary estimates ranged to 200,000 souls, gaunt with hunger,
their provisions scanty, their children wan from months of flight. The Emperor Valens, recognizing both the danger and the opportunity, new recruits for an army perpetually short of manpower, granted them passage. It was a fateful decision, an inauspicious bargain struck in haste that would reverberate for generations. Among those who stumbled across the pontoon bridges were mothers clutching infants too weak to cry, their milk long since dried up, bartering the last of their jewelry for a handful of grain that the Roman sentries weighed with theatrical indifference before waving them through.
The reception was appalling. Roman officials, rapacious and contemptuous, their treatment of the refugees egregious even by the standards of the age, exploited the refugees' desperation with callous efficiency. Lupicinus, the Roman Count of Thrace, and his colleague Maximus, diverted the supplies earmarked by the emperor, running a black market in human misery, selling dog meat at exorbitant prices, demanding Gothic children as slaves in exchange for paltry rations. Ammianus records the infamy with controlled fury. When Lupicinus invited the Gothic leaders to a banquet at Marcianople, the Roman commander, reclining at the prodigal table amid noisy entertainments, drowsy and half-drunk, had their bodyguards killed. Fritigern, the quick-witted Visigothic chief, persuaded Lupicinus to release him, lest the situation deteriorate further, walked out of the dining hall, and immediately rallied his people for war. Rome had manufactured its own enemy. And while Lupicinus's attention was fixed on the Thervingi, the Groi Thungi, another Gothic people, also begging entry, simply crossed the unguarded Danube behind him. The denouement came at Adrianople on August 9, 378 AD. The army Valens led into Thrace was not the superb legionary force of the Antonine age. Those close-order formations of men wielding the short gladius behind the great curved scutum had passed into memory. Diocletian and Constantine had rebuilt the military from the ground up, smaller, more mobile units of Commodus-as-Hercules, carrying the longer slashing spada and round shield, their ridge helmets riveted from iron plates rather than wrought in a single piece, their tactical doctrine reshaped for a world where cavalry increasingly decided battles. Yet these were still Rome's best, the mobile field army, the core striking power of the Eastern Empire, transferred at enormous cost from the Persian frontier to end the Gothic emergency. Valens was consumed by jealousy of his young nephew Gratian's celebrated victory over the Alemanni. His courtiers urged haste lest Gratian claim a share of the glory. He led this irreplaceable force against a foe he had gravely underestimated. His scouts had reported only 10,000 Gothic warriors, counting the infantry visible near the wagon laager, but missing the cavalry entirely. The Roman Commodus-as marched 8 miles through the blazing summer sun, arriving exhausted, parched, and overheated at the Gothic wagon circle. Fritigern, knowing his cavalry under Alatheus and Saphrax had not yet returned from foraging, played for time, sending envoys to propose peace terms he had no intention of honoring, buying every precious minute until the thunder of hooves on the surrounding hills announced the return of Gothic, Alan, and Hunnic horsemen. They struck the Roman flanks without warning. The raucous war cries of the Gothic warriors mingled with the piercing screams of the wounded and the resonant thud of bodies striking the earth. The Roman cavalry broke and scattered. The infantry, now exposed on every side, was compressed into a suffocating mass. Soldiers were packed so tightly they could not draw their spathae or pull back their arms. Clouds of dust blotted out the sky. Arrows whirled death from every direction. The rout was total. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army perished in a single afternoon, their bodies strewn across the Thracian plain in scenes of macabre devastation. Ammianus, reaching for the most devastating comparison in his arsenal, wrote that the annals record no such massacre of a battle except the one at Cannae, Hannibal's destruction of a Roman army 6 centuries earlier. Among the dead lay not only the rank and file, but 35 tribunes, regimental commanders whose irreplaceable institutional knowledge perished with them, and the emperor himself. Valens fell. His body was never recovered, presumably consumed in the conflagration when Goths set fire to the peasant farmhouse where wounded Romans had taken shelter. An emperor, burning to death in a hovel, surrounded by enemies his own government had created. It was the end of an era. Adrianople was not, as some have claimed, the death blow to the empire, But it was a rupture from which the western half would never fully recover, a wound that disclosed the truth no amount of imperial rhetoric could occlude. Rome could no longer defeat its enemies in open battle with any certainty. The contemporary military writer Vegetius, composing his Epitome Rei Militaris in the shadow of this catastrophe, lamented that the Roman soldier had grown so negligent he begged leave to set aside first his cuirass, then his helmet, until stripped of armor and exposed to wounds, he thought of nothing but flight. Whether or not his diagnosis was fair, the Eastern field army that perished at Adrianople could not simply be rebuilt. The officer corps was gone, the fiscal machinery already straining, the pool of citizen recruits long since exhausted. The settlement that followed, negotiated by the Emperor Theodosius in 382, established a fateful precedent. For centuries, Rome had absorbed individual barbarian recruits into its own units under Roman officers. The auxiliary system that had once turned provincial outsiders into disciplined soldiers within a single generation. Now, for the first time on this scale, an entire barbarian people was settled within Roman territory as foederati, autonomous allies keeping their own laws, their own leaders, their own military command, fighting as a national army under Gothic chieftains rather than as individuals dispersed through Roman formations. The old martial confidence, once so puissant that it seemed a sempiternal feature of the world, had been shattered. In its place grew something unfamiliar and corrosive, a creeping apprehension, a visceral dissonance between the empire's self-image and its diminished reality. Part 8. The Sack of Rome, 410 and 455 AD. Sex 2.0. The unthinkable became real on August 24, 410 AD, when Alaric and his Visigoths breached the Porta Salaria, the gate on the northeastern stretch of the Aurelian walls where the ancient Via Salaria, the Salt Road, exited Rome toward the Sabine Hills, and poured into the Eternal City. It was the culmination of 3 sieges in 2 years. In the first, Alaric had blockaded the city and strangled its grain supply until the Senate ransomed itself with 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver. In the second, he had seized the port of Ostia and installed a puppet emperor, and now, after one final negotiation was sabotaged by a rival Gothic chieftain loyal to Honorius, patience gave way to fury. According to Procopius, 300 youths of good birth and valor had entered Rome disguised as slaves presented to unsuspecting senators. At a prearranged signal, they fell upon the guards at the Salarian gate, killed them, and threw open the doors to receive the Gothic army. For 3 days, Rome, unconquered by a foreign enemy for 800 years, since the Gauls under Brennus sacked it in 390 BC, was subjected to a pillage that, while restrained by the standards of ancient warfare, sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. The sack was not indiscriminate. Alaric, an Arian Christian, ordered the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul designated as sanctuaries, and Orosius records Gothic soldiers escorting sacred vessels back to St. Peter's in solemn procession through streets still echoing with the chaos of plunder. But the psychological devastation transcended any merely physical accounting. The sensory reality of those 3 days haunted survivors for a lifetime. The acrid smoke that rose from the burning gardens of Sallust, that magnificent parkland near the Salarian Gate, once the private estate of the great historian, then an imperial pleasure ground, now consumed by flames that would leave it a ruin never rebuilt, hung over the city in a fuliginous pall, dimming the summer sun to a murky copper disk. Procopius, writing more than a century later, noted that the house of Sallust still stood half-burned in his own time, the scar of a single night persisting across the generations. The cacophonous din of looting, the grating screech of iron bars wrenching open doors, the rasping of swords dragged across marble floors, the screeching of hinges torn from ancient frames, was punctuated by cries that ranged from the shrill keening of the bereaved to the boisterous revelry of victorious warriors drunk on plundered wine. The stench was inescapable and noisome, the pungent reek of spilled olive oil mixing with the putrid sweetness of unburied corpses in the summer heat, the rank odor of horse dung in streets that had known only the measured tread of senators, the malodorous miasma of burning wool and scorched grain. In the Forum,
The fire in the Basilica Aemilia burned so hot that bronze coins, dated to the reign of Priscus Attalus, the puppet emperor Alaric himself had raised and deposed the year before, melted into the marble pavement, fusing into a destruction layer 6 to 10 centimeters thick, where their green-stained traces can still be seen today, the coin's oxidized copper permanently bonded to the stone. A sepulchral silence fell over districts where the looting had passed, broken only by the crackle of dying fires. Everything that had been lustrous was now tarnished. What had been exquisite was defaced. What had been sublime was profaned.
The poignant irony was not lost on contemporaries. The city that had sacked Carthage, Jerusalem, and Corinth was itself now sacked. The sack sullied more than buildings, it stained the very idea of civilization. Statues were toppled and disfigured, temples that had stood since the Republic were desecrated and befouled. The ignominy of it was palpable. The greatest city the world had ever known, humbled and debased by the very peoples it had once dismissed as boorish, uncouth savages. The obloquy that fell upon the imperial government, upon the craven courtiers at Ravenna who had abandoned Rome to its fate, upon the callow emperor Honorius who on the 22nd of August 408 had ordered the execution of his own best general, the half-vandal Stilicho, then stood by while Roman soldiers massacred the families of barbarian auxiliaries throughout Italy, thereby driving 30,000 desperate men into Alaric's welcoming arms, was fierce and unsparing. A courtier would later apply the same verdict when Valentinian III murdered Aetius, the last great Roman general, in 454. You have cut off your right hand with your left. Their infamy would prove as enduring as the ruins they left behind. Jerome, writing from his cell in Bethlehem in elegiac prose that would echo down the centuries, gave voice to the world's Heiraeth, that untranslatable Welsh longing for a homeland that exists now only in memory. My voice sticks in my throat, he wrote to the Roman widow Principia in his letter 127, and sobs choke my utterance. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The bright light of all the world, he wrote in his commentary on Ezekiel, was put out. What settled over the Roman world was something worse than grief, a collective malneurophrenia, the numb disorientation of a civilization waking into a nightmare from which there could be no retreat into the comfort of prior certainties. Alaric himself did not long survive his triumph. He died at Cosenza later that year, and his warriors diverted the river Busento, buried their king in its bed with the spoils of Rome, then turned the waters back and killed every captive who had dug the grave, so that none might ever reveal where the conqueror of the eternal city lay. The tomb has never been found. 45 years later, it happened again, and worse. In 455 AD, the Vandals under Genseric sacked Rome for 2 weeks, stripping the city with the methodical precision of auctioneers. The trigger was sordid. The Emperor Valentinian III had murdered his own greatest general, Aetius, then been murdered himself by Aetius's retainers. The usurper Petronius Maximus had seized the throne, forced the widowed Empress Eudoxia to marry him, and broken the betrothal of her daughter Eudocia to Genseric's son, Huneric, a personal insult that gave the Vandal king his casus belli. Whether Eudoxia herself appealed to Genseric for rescue, as Procopius claims, remains disputed, but Genseric needed little invitation to plunder. Maximus, attempting to flee, was stoned to death by a Roman mob. His body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. Pope Leo I met Genseric outside the walls and reportedly negotiated terms that spared the inhabitants' lives, but could not save the city's treasures. The Vandal fleet had sailed from Carthage and now disgorged its soldiers at the mouth of the Tiber. For 14 days, his soldiers stripped the city with cold, systematic thoroughness, carrying off the golden menorah from the Temple of Jerusalem that Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier, the sacred vessels depicted on the Arch of Titus that still stands in the Forum, loading ships with statuary and jewels, tearing the gilded bronze tiles from the very roof of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, and taking the Empress Eudoxia and her 2 daughters as hostages. Where Alaric's sack had been a frisson of violence tempered by Christian scruple, Genseric's was a cold, systematic spoliation,
a defiling of everything Rome had built and represented. The menorah itself would travel onward, from Rome to Carthage, from Carthage to Constantinople when Belisarius conquered the Vandal kingdom in 534, and from Constantinople by Justinian's command back at last to Jerusalem, a sacred object's odyssey mirroring the trajectory of empire itself.
The physical damage was devastating, but the true wound was to the idea of Rome itself. The shadow of these events, a darkness not of the sky but of the soul, fell across the entire Mediterranean world. St. Augustine, who had died during the Vandal siege of his own city of Hippo in 430 AD, had already begun the intellectual work of reconciliation in his city of God, commenced in 412, completed in 426, 22 books arguing that the earthly city was always ephemeral, always subordinate to the eternal, that Christians must not identify their hopes with any political order, for Rome's fall merely proved what should have been obvious, that no earthly power endures. It was cold comfort, but it was the only comfort available to a generation that had watched the unimaginable unfold before their eyes. The Roman world had entered its crepuscule, not yet dark, but dimming, the old certainties dissolving like the last light before nightfall. Part 9. The Last Emperor and the Afterlife of Empire. Metapause, Sex 2.0. The end, when it came, was anticlimactic, almost absurdly so. On September 4, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy of perhaps 15 whose name, Romulus Augustulus, seemed a cruel joke of history, combining the founder of the city with the founder of the empire, then diminishing both with the contemptuous diminutive Augustulus, the little Augustus. The symmetry ran deeper than names. Odoacer's father, Edico, had served alongside the boy's father, Orestes, in the diplomatic corps of Attila the Hun, two men who had once carried the same tyrant's messages to Constantinople, now settling the fate of the West between their sons. Orestes had already been captured and executed at Ticinum. His brother Paulus was killed in the fighting near Ravenna. The boy they had placed on the throne stood alone and defenseless. There was no battle for the purple itself, no grand confrontation, no elegiac scene worthy of the occasion. The boy emperor, faint-hearted and bewildered, simply abdicated before the Senate at Ravenna, was granted a pension of 6,000 gold solidi, the income of a wealthy senator, and dispatched to the Castellum Lucullanum near Naples, the seaside villa of the Republican general Lucullus, now a gilded cage. He may have lived quietly for decades. A letter from Theodoric the Great, written some 30 years later, appears to confirm pension arrangements for a certain Romulus and his mother, the last Western emperor, possibly ending his days as an elderly pensioner on a Campanian promontory, history's grandest anticlimax made flesh. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple robes, the ornamenta palatii, to the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople with a message that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. It was a prosaic conclusion to an epic, mundane, where one might have expected the apocalyptic, pedestrian, where the occasion demanded the sublime. What followed was less a void than an interregnum, a liminal passage between one order and the next. The Western provinces, already autonomous in all but name, adjusted to the new reality with remarkable insouciance. Gothic and Frankish kings adopted Roman titles, maintained Roman roads, administered Roman law, the trappings of empire surviving the empire itself in a form of cultural afterlife that complicates any simple narrative of fall. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who overthrew Odoacer in turn and ruled Italy from Ravenna, governed through Roman administrators, restored aqueducts, repaired the Colosseum, maintained the ancient Cloaca Maxima, and patronized Latin scholars. His chief minister Cassiodorus compiled 468 official letters documenting a kingdom that consciously sustained Roman institutional life, so effectively that his reign has been called the Indian summer of classical civilization in Italy. Clovis, king of the Franks,
shrewdly converted to Catholic rather than Arian Christianity, aligning himself with the Gallo-Roman bishops and population, and establishing the dynasty that would evolve, through Charlemagne, into the foundations of France and Germany. The fragility of political authority was revealed in sharp contrast to the lasting influence of Roman institutions. Latin remained the lingua franca of the educated. Roman engineering continued to supply water and drain sewage. The Catholic Church, organized along imperial provincial lines, its dioceses matching Diocletian's administrative boundaries, its bishops functioning as de facto civic leaders, provided a continuity of administration that the secular state could no longer guarantee.
In the east, Constantinople endured, not merely survived but flourished, its walls impregnable, its commerce vibrant, its intellectual traditions unbroken. The Theodosian walls, 6.5 kilometers of triple fortification stretching from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, stood essentially unbreached for 1,000 years. The city's illustrious scholars preserved the lore of antiquity, the hermetic texts of late pagan philosophy, the arcane mathematical treatises of Alexandria, the abstruse medical writings of Galen, that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Justinian raised Hagia Sophia, its pendentive dome soaring 55 meters above a nave flooded with light through 40 arched windows, the largest enclosed interior space in the world, and then attempted to reconquer the western provinces, a quixotic enterprise that succeeded militarily but ultimately proved a Pyrrhic victory, exhausting the eastern treasury for gains that could not be held. But his Corpus Juris Civilis, the great codification of Roman law, compiled by the jurist Tribonian between 528 and 534, would be rediscovered in the 11th century and become the foundation of European jurisprudence, still shaping the legal systems of every nation on the continent today. The Eastern Empire, which we call Byzantine, though its inhabitants called themselves Roman until the very end, would persist for another millennium, a living palimpsest in which Greek, Roman, and Christian elements overlaid one another in endlessly fascinating permutations. What, then, was lost? The question has occupied historians since Gibbon first set pen to paper, and it admits no cogent answer in brief. The material losses were staggering and lamentable. Libraries burned, aqueducts crumbled, cities that had housed hundreds of thousands dwindled to villages huddled among dilapidated ruins. The Roman Forum itself became the Campo Vaccino, a cattle pasture where lime kilns consumed ancient marble for morite, while livestock grazed among toppled columns and farmers grew vegetables in the shadow of triumphal arches. The knowledge of concrete was forgotten. The self-healing properties of Roman pozzolanic cement, whose volcanic ash and quicklime mixture allowed the Pantheon's dome to stand for nearly 2 millennia, would not be rediscovered for 13 centuries until an English engineer studied the problem anew. The ability to produce glass of Roman clarity would not return for centuries. Western glassmakers resorted to melting down Roman fragments rather than smelting fresh raw glass, each generation's vessels cruder than the last. Tiled roofs, a commonplace even on Roman peasant houses, became a great rarity, replaced by insect-ridden thatch. The technique of building in mortared stone vanished entirely from Britain. Wheel-made pottery, mass-produced and distributed across the entire Mediterranean world in the 2nd century, African red slipware shipped from Tunisian workshops to tables in Gaul and Britain alike, vanished from the archaeological record within a generation of the legion's departure, replaced by crude, handmade vessels that would have embarrassed a pre-Roman potter. Somewhere in Britain, the last man who knew how to throw a pot on a wheel died, and the knowledge died with him. No manual, no apprentice, no record of his name. The bronze coinage that had sustained everyday market transactions disappeared, and with it, the very possibility of buying a loaf of bread from a stranger for cash. Even the livestock diminished. Cattle and sheep shrank measurably as centuries of selective Roman breeding gave way to subsistence husbandry. More inscriptions survive from Roman Britain alone than from the entirety of post-Roman Western Europe over 3 subsequent centuries, a statistical monument to the catastrophic contraction of literacy. The lacuna in scholarship, the void in technical expertise, the sheer intellectual impoverishment of the post-Roman West,
These were not romantic abstractions, but tangible deprivations that consigned millions to lives of grinding hardship. An entire civilization's ken, its mastery of engineering, its proficiency in governance, its command of the natural world, contracted to a fraction of what it had been. Where once erudite polymaths had debated in marble academies, now unlettered monks in wretched scriptoria labored to copy manuscripts they could barely comprehend, preserving by rote what they could not fully fathom. The diminished centuries that followed were not dark because the sun ceased to shine, but because the illumination of accumulated knowledge had been so catastrophically diminished. The empire's legacy proved more resilient than its legions. Roman law, codified by Justinian, would form the foundation of European jurisprudence. The Latin language, not the literary prose of Cicero, but the colloquial vulgar Latin spoken by soldiers, merchants, and farmers across the provinces, evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, the classical focus becoming fuoco and feu and fuego, each daughter tongue a living testament to the perduring vitality of a supposedly dead mother. Christianity, Rome's most consequential export, carried within its liturgy and theology the ghostly imprint of imperial structures. Diocese and province, patriarch and pontiff, the Pope himself inheriting the title Pontifex Maximus from the pagan emperors who preceded him. The very concept of a universal church mirroring the universal state that had nurtured it.
Perhaps the most enduring legacy was an idea, the idea of empire itself, of a political order capacious enough to encompass diverse peoples under a common law, fostering amity where there had been enmity, and forging a shared civilization. On Christmas Day of the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne in St. Peter's Basilica, and the Frankish king rose as Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, the first man to claim that title in the West in more than 3 centuries, fusing Roman tradition, Christian authority, and Frankish military power into a new European political form. The Holy Roman Empire would sustain the claim for another 844 years, however attenuated, longer than the Western Roman Empire itself had endured. Napoleon reached for the same mantle, and in 1957, 6 nations gathered in the Palazzo dei Conservatori on the Capitoline Hill itself to sign the Treaty of Rome, echoing the ancient aspiration in the founding of the European project. The dream of Roma Eterna proved more sempiternal than the stones of the Forum, which crumbled, or the roads that crossed 3 continents, which were slowly reclaimed by the encroaching wilderness. And so the story of Rome's fall is also, ineluctably, the story of Rome's persistence, a reminder that civilizations do not simply die but undergo transfigurations, their essential elements dispersing into the cultural soil to nourish forms their founders could never have imagined. The eternal city's twilight was long, and it has never quite ended. Even now, we who reckon our years from the birth of a man executed under Roman authority, who organize our thoughts in grammatical structures descended from Latin, who govern ourselves by principles first articulated in the Roman Senate, even now, we are the inheritors of that vanished world, living proof that the ephemeral and the sempiternal are not opposites, but partners. Every civilization leaves its imprint on those that follow, as letters on a palimpsest, never fully erased. Now, let us revisit some of the remarkable words you encountered in this story. You will hear each word in the context where it first appeared. Take a moment to recall its meaning. Then listen for an explanation that brings the word to life once more. We describe the city of Rome as the apotheosis of human ambition, a metropolis of marble and ambrosial gardens at the peak of its glory. What does apotheosis mean? Apotheosis means the highest point of development, the culmination or ideal example of something, and, in its original sense, the elevation of a person to divine status. When we call Rome the apotheosis of human ambition, we mean it represented the absolute pinnacle, the point beyond which ambition itself could scarcely imagine reaching. Rome reveled in a superabundance that felt sempiternal, and later, the old martial confidence once seemed a sempiternal feature of the world. What does sempiternal mean? Sempiternal means eternal, everlasting, enduring without end. It carries a slightly more literary weight than simply saying eternal, suggesting something that has always existed and always will. The cruel irony the story traces is that everything the Romans believed sempiternal proved devastatingly ephemeral. Marcus Aurelius possessed a mind of extraordinary acuity, pellucid in its reasoning, lucid in its self-examination. What does pellucid mean? Pellucid means translucently clear, so clear that you can see right through it. Applied to thought or writing, it describes reasoning of such crystalline clarity that nothing is obscured, nothing hidden. Marcus Aurelius's meditations are pellucid because they illuminate the deepest questions of existence in language anyone can understand. Commodus's mockery of the imperial office was described as a flagitious desecration of the dignity that men like Marcus Aurelius had upheld. What does flagitious mean? Flagitious means shamefully wicked, not merely bad, but scandalously, outrageously so. It describes conduct so far beyond the pale of acceptable behavior that it provokes not just disapproval, but moral horror. A flagitious act is one that shames everyone associated with it, staining the very institution it defiles. Those who witnessed Commodus's spectacles felt a crapulence of the soul, the nausea that comes from overexposure to the grotesque. What does crapulence mean? Crapulence is the sickness that follows overindulgence, the queasy, head-spinning aftermath of having consumed too much. Normally, it describes the physical consequences of excessive eating or drinking, but the story extends it beautifully. A crapulence of the soul, meaning the spiritual nausea that comes from witnessing too much depravity. The court of Commodus became a pit of skullduggery and legerdemain, a place where advancement depended on one's willingness to participate in delusion. What does skullduggery mean? Skullduggery means underhanded, dishonest dealing, secret scheming and trickery conducted behind closed doors. It implies not the grand villainy of an open tyrant, but the furtive machinations of courtiers, fixers, and backroom operators. Paired with legerdemain, sleight of hand, it paints a picture of governance reduced to a confidence trick. The 3rd century was described as a maelstrom of vicissitude, a century of flux and fracture that nearly destroyed the Roman state. What does vicissitude mean? Vicissitude means a change of circumstances, especially one that is unwelcome or unpleasant, the unpredictable turns of fortune that no amount of planning can forestall. Used in the plural, vicissitude suggests a relentless succession of upheavals, each battering the sufferer before recovery from the last is complete. The capture of Emperor Valerian by the Sassanid Persians was called an ignominious humiliation without precedent. What does ignominious mean? Ignominious means deserving or causing public disgrace, a shame so deep and so visible that it cannot be concealed or explained away. An ignominious defeat is one that brings lasting dishonor, the kind that gets carved into the enemy's rock reliefs and retold for centuries. Ignominy is fame inverted, renown for failure rather than achievement. Christians under Diocletian were subjected to contumely and torture, insolent abuse heaped upon those whose only crime was their faith. What does contumely mean? Contumely means insolent or insulting language or treatment. Contempt expressed not quietly, but with deliberate, humiliating cruelty. It is the vocabulary of the powerful toward the powerless. Not mere disagreement, but the active degradation of another's dignity. Shakespeare used the word in Hamlet's most famous soliloquy, the proud man's contumely, to describe the arrogant abuse that makes life unbearable. Diocletian declined to return to power with sang-froid, observing that his cabbages were temptation enough. What does sang-froid mean? Sang-froid, literally, cold blood in French, means composure under pressure, the ability to remain cool and unperturbed when others might panic or waver. Diocletian's sang-froid was remarkable because he was the only Roman emperor to voluntarily surrender absolute power, and he did so with the casual ease of a man who had genuinely found something better to do. The story asks whether Constantine's vision constituted a genuine metanoia or a calculated political maneuver. What does metanoia mean? Metanoia means a transformative change of heart, a profound inner revolution that fundamentally alters how a person sees the world. It comes from Greek, where it literally means a change of mind, but it implies something deeper than mere opinion change, a spiritual or moral conversion so complete that the person who emerges is essentially new. Whether Constantine truly experienced metanoia remains one of history's great unanswered questions. Constantinople possessed an almost numinous quality, as though its founder had been gifted with prescience denied to ordinary mortals. What does numinous mean? Numinous means having a strong religious or spiritual quality, an aura of the sacred, the divine, or the transcendent. A numinous place or experience evokes a sense of something beyond the material world, something that inspires awe and reverence. Constantinople's survival for 1,000 years after Rome's fall gave it that numinous quality, as if the city existed under supernatural protection. The old martial confidence of Rome was described as once so puissant that it seemed a sempiternal feature of the world. What does puissant mean? Puissant means powerful, mighty, influential, having great force or authority. It is an archaic and literary word, the kind that carries the weight of medieval chronicles and courtly language. When we call Rome's martial confidence puissant, we convey not just strength, but the kind of overwhelming, undeniable power that shapes the world around it. The smoke from burning Rome hung over the city in a fuliginous pall, dimming the summer sun to a murky copper disk. What does fuliginous mean? Fuliginous means sooty, murky, dark as smoke. The color and quality of a sky thick with the residue of combustion. It comes from the Latin fuligo, meaning soot. A fuliginous pall is a blanket of darkness that is not clean or natural but grimy, suffocating, carrying the particulate evidence of destruction in every breath. Jerome gave voice to the world's Heireth, that untranslatable Welsh longing for a homeland that exists now only in memory. What does Heireth mean? Heireth is a Welsh word for a deep, inconsolable longing for a home you can never return to, perhaps because it no longer exists, or because it has changed beyond recognition, or because the version of yourself who lived there is gone. It is homesickness, elevated to an existential condition. The story uses it for the entire Roman world's grief. A civilization mourning not just a city, but the idea of itself. What settled over the Roman world was a collective malneurophrenia, the numb disorientation of a civilization waking into a nightmare. What does malneurophrenia mean? Malneurophrenia is the lingering unease that follows waking from a nightmare. That disoriented, unsettled feeling when the boundary between dream and reality has not yet fully resolved. The story uses it as a metaphor for an entire civilization's psychological state, the horrifying realization that the nightmare is not something you wake up from. It is the new reality. The Roman world had entered its crepuscule, not yet dark, but dimming, the old certainties dissolving like the last light before nightfall. What does crepuscule mean? Crepuscule means twilight, that liminal hour between day and night, when the world is neither illuminated nor fully dark. It is the noun form of crepuscular, relating to the dim, uncertain light of dusk. The story uses it as the final metaphor for Rome's condition, not dead, not alive, but suspended in a prolonged half-light, still glowing but inexorably fading. The Eastern Empire was described as a living palimpsest, Greek, Roman, and Christian elements overlaying one another in endlessly fascinating permutations. What does palimpsest mean? A palimpsest is a manuscript page that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again. Yet traces of the original text remain visible beneath the new. By extension, it describes anything bearing visible layers of its own history. A city where Roman columns support medieval walls and modern shop fronts. Or a civilization where forgotten influences still shape the present. Rome itself is the ultimate palimpsest. Every era written over the last, but none entirely erased. The end.